Hello there, Felix back again. Almost December and it's awfully cold outside. Me and the wife have been leaving the heating on a lot longer than usual, which isn't great because of how expensive the heating now is, but oh well, what can be done, eh? Let me begin with the email. It was plain, anonymous and concise. Haunting at the Bleeding Rose, Whitechapel. It was driving away business. I can't take much more. Attached was a single photograph of the pub, a brick relic of East London, with a wrought iron sign swaying above its door. The kind of place you walk past a couple of 100 times without glancing. Now, I would have preferred to leave this to Virgil or the specialist branch, but the higher-ups have insisted I undertake minor field work as part of my continuing professional development, or CPD, as our interim director insists on calling it. "You've been at the archives too long, Felix," they said. "Time to get your hands dirty." I suspect this is less about improving on my investigative skills and more about staying grounded to the cases that I work on. After all, it's easy to lose sight of the reality of these hauntings when your days are simply spent cataloguing dusty old records. Still, there is an unspoken rule among us archivists. The dead deserve their stories to be told, and this case would be like any other. Mr. Hayward, the pub's landlord, was waiting inside. The kind of man who seemed sculpted by the very wood and stone of the building he owned, broad shoulders, balding, and weathered by time. His voice had the rasp of too many cigarettes, and his demeanour was a blend of bluster and quiet defeat. He greeted me without ceremony, holding the door open with one hand and clutching a glass of something strong with the other. The air inside the pub was warm and thick, a faint tang of distilled beer mingling with the trace of something sharper. Fear, perhaps. Hayward reminded me of the men my father used to drink with back in Camberwell. I would watch them in the corner of the room as a child, their hands stained with grease and paint, their conversations peppered with gruff laughter and acceptance of life's injustices. Hayward had the same air about him, hardworking, practical, unflinching, but worn down at the edges. There was a particular nervous energy about him though, as though he was grappling with something outside his usual orbit of stubborn repairs and late-night brawls. He ushered me over to a booth near the bar, fidgeting with the corner of his apron, his eyes darting towards the cellar door like it might open on its own. "Didn't want to call you lot," he admitted, setting his glass down heavily and pouring another drink. "But the staff won't go near the basement, and the regulars are starting to talk, saying it's cursed, haunted. Whatever it is, it's bad for business." Landlords, in my experience, are often the first line of defense against stories like these. They are the gatekeepers of buildings steeped in history, the keepers of whispered tales shared over late-night drinks, unwitting custodians of places that bear the weight of lives long gone. Hayward fit the mold perfectly, a man who didn't believe in ghosts, but had seen enough to wonder. "You lot at the archives must have seen worse than this," he muttered, pouring himself another drink and glancing at me for reassurance. He didn't need to know I'd spent the last 10 years buried in records. My closest brushes with the supernatural limited to the occasional misfired artifact glowing faintly under the archival lamps, and of course that time I was on holiday with the missus and I had to confront an old hag with a bit of limited spell knowledge I'd picked up over the years. This wasn't my usual role. Field work was more Virgil's arena, but as part of my CPD I was here. They wanted me on the ground, confronting the world outside of the archive's insulated halls. Hayward sighed, his bravado faltering for a moment. "Not just the whispers," he said, lowering his voice. "It's the bloody cold down there, and things move by themselves. Last week, a crate of gin smashed itself into pieces. I wasn't even in the bloody room." He gestured towards the cellar door, a weathered thing with brass handles dulled by time. "You'll see for yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you." The basement, unsurprisingly, was the epicenter. Hayward handed me a rusted key and backed away as he muttered, "Good luck." before retreating to the safety of his bar. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a staircase that plunged into darkness. The steps groaned underfoot as I descended, each one releasing a faint puff of dust into the air. The flashlight in my hand cast narrow beams of light across the stone walls, which glistened faintly with condensation. The air wasn't just cold here, it was heavy, oppressive, like the weight of the building's past had been compressed into a single space. I had barely reached the bottom of the stairs when I already started to hear it. At first, a faint whisper. A child's voice, I presume, clipped and sharp, reverberating through the stillness. Get out. For a moment I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but then the sound was gone, leaving only a silence in its wake. I scanned the room with my flashlight, its beam trembling slightly as I forced myself to move forward. The basement was filled with crates and shelves, its corners cloaked in the shadows that seemed unnaturally deep. The faint hum of the pub's boiler echoed from somewhere above, the only sign I hadn't stumbled into some other realm. Despite the cold, sweat pricked at the back of my neck. I set down my bag and began to unpack my tools, an EMF reader, audio recorder, notebook. Cursory scan of the space revealed no obvious disturbances, although the temperature hovered unnaturally low. As I stood there in the gloom, I couldn't shake the sensation I was being watched. I turned towards the stair, half expecting to see Hayward peering down at me, but the doorway above remained empty. The whispering lingered in my head, sharp and unshakable. For now, I had no answers, only questions. I returned to the bar where Hayward greeted me with a raised eyebrow and a fresh drink. "Well?" he asked, the word laced with equal parts of hope and dread. "It's unusual. It is unusual," I said carefully, unwilling to alarm him further, "but I will need more time to figure out what we're dealing with." He nodded, clearly unsatisfied but unwilling to press. As I left the pub that night, I resolved to dig deeper into its history, to understand the story buried beneath the floorboards. The archives were my next stop. The name Sid appeared again and again in local lore, whispered in fragments among the patrons who hadn't yet abandoned the pub. They spoke of a boy darting in the corner of their vision, of cold spots and restless nights. His name came up in muttered stories, each one contradicting the last. "He's just a rumour," some said, "a ghost made up to scare newcomers." Others swore he'd heard his laughter, sharp and bitter, echoing from the basement after closing. The tales all carried the same undercurrent: sadness, anger, and something unresolved. So to learn more, I sought out Dr. Marion Greaves, a historian with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, whose expertise often overlapped with the archive's work. Her flat in Whitechapel was more of a library than a living space, the kind of home where furniture existed purely to support teetering stacks of books. The scent of old paper mingled with damp wool, the lingering effect of London's ever-present rain. Marion and I had crossed paths before, most notably during the Brick Lane Orbs case, Class 5 temporal rupture phenomenon that nearly cost an internee sanity. Her work often brought her dangerously close to the kind of entities that stretched the boundaries of understanding. She greeted me at the door with her usual blend of academic curiosity and thinly veiled exasperation.
"Let me guess,"
she said, before I'd even spoken.
"Another dead thing that won't stay quiet?"
She ushered me inside, the door closing with a groan. Without waiting for pleasantries, Marion drove into the mountain of records, pulling down file after file with brisk efficiency of someone who had long since memorized the location of every scrap of paper she owned.
"Sid was an orphan,"
she began, rifling through the pile of yellowed files as I set my coat down on the only chair not completely covered in books.
"One of countless street kids scraping by however they could in Victorian Whitechapel. He got picked up for theft, stealing a loaf of bread, if you can believe it, and thrown into the Whitechapel asylum."
Her words painted a grim picture, each detail like another brick in the wall that I didn't want to see the end of. Victorian London was no friend of its poor, and Whitechapel in particular seemed to thrive on stories of abandonment and cruelty. I'd spent hours in the archive cataloguing similar tales, but they never grew easier to hear.
The asylum wasn't just a place for the insane. It was a dumping ground for anyone society wanted to forget. Orphans, vagrants, women whose husbands didn't want them anymore. Sid was just one of many. He was small, quick, and probably clever enough to survive the streets.
She handed me a brittle newspaper clipping, the edge frayed like old lace. Boy found dead in asylum cell, the headline read, stark and unflinching. The story beneath it was brief, almost dismissive. It detailed Sid's death during the typhus outbreak in 1892. Solitary confinement, it seemed, had been his final punishment. I took the clipping carefully, my gloved hands trembling slightly as I read. The language of the report was cold, clinical. It spoke of overcrowding, disease and neglect with some tone that one might use to discuss the weather. As an archivist, I deal in the remnants of lives, letters, photographs, medical records, but there's something uniquely haunting about the knowledge that someone's entire existence can be reduced to a few lines of faded ink. Sid's story wasn't unique, not in this city, not at that time, and yet it is harder than most. Perhaps because he hadn't just been forgotten, he'd been discarded. Marion leaned back on her chair, her expression softening slightly.
Clever enough to survive the streets, but not clever enough to escape the system. He was angry, Felix. Angry and scared, and why wouldn't he be? A child left to rot in a place like that. It's no wonder he's still here, making a racket. Spirits like Sid, they don't leave because they don't feel they've been heard. They don't leave because they don't feel it's over.
I nodded, tucking the clipping into my bag. Her words lingered as I left, carried with me into the fog-choked streets. Sid's story was one of countless others, and yet it demanded to be told. Perhaps it was that drew me to the case, beyond the CPD mandate and my usual curiosity. The dead are restless when the stories remain unheard, and I'd been tasked by fate, or bureaucracy, to listen. Sid's fury became tangible 3 nights into my investigation. By that point, I'd grown accustomed to the uneasy atmosphere in the basement, though accustomed may be too generous of a word. The space never truly felt inert. Even when it was still, it felt like as though something unseen was pressing against the walls, coiled tight like a spring waiting to snap. I'd set up a rudimentary monitoring station in the far corner, a tripod-mounted audio recorder, an EMF reader balanced on a crate, and a thermal imaging camera burrowed by Rue in security. "Good luck getting that in one piece," he said. Yes, of course, instilled me with lots of confidence. The first night wasn't much to report, to be honest. Most of the sounds were coming from the rooms above, and there was an EMF spike, but it could have been linked to the wiring of the pub. A quiet night in paranormal terms isn't always a blessing. Sometimes it's just the calm before the storm. The third night began much the same. Upstairs, the muffled sounds of conversation filtered through the floorboards, an anchor in the living world. Downstairs, silence reigned. I settled into the stall I had dragged in from the bar, notebook in hand, and as the equipment hummed softly around me, the temperature hovered at a steady 13 degrees Celsius. Chilly but tolerable. Then, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the air changed. It wasn't just cold, it was a sudden, bone-deep chill that sucked the warmth from my room. My breath misted in the beam of my flashlight, a pale ribbon of vapor that hung unnaturally in the air. The EMF reader spiked wildly, its tiny red lights flashing erratically. My skin prickled, a physiological reaction I recognized as fear, though my mind scrambled to rationalize it as a change in atmospheric pressure. And then the chaos began. Bottles threw from shelves with the force of a battering ram, shattering against the stone floor in an explosion of sound. A crate of gin, one of the sturdy old wooden ones, splintered in the corner as though being kicked by an unseen boot. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in the oppressive dark. Save for the dim green glow of the EMF reader, The noise was deafening, glass breaking, wood cracking, and something else, a low guttural growl, faint but unmistakable. "Sid?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling in the darkness. He answered. His form materialized like smoke coalescing into shape. A child-sized figure with jagged edges that seemed to blur and reform as though he were fighting to stay visible. His face, as if it could be called that, was twisted, eyes burning with fury, mouth stretched into a snarl. He pointed at me with a trembling hand, and his voice, impossibly loud for something so small, tore through the room.
"You can't fix it,"
he screamed, the sound sharp enough to make my ears ring. It wasn't just anger in his tone, it was despair too, beneath the rage. Despair and something dangerously close to hopelessness. I froze. Every instinct I had screamed at me to flee, to retreat up to the stairs and leave the basement and its spectre behind. I'd read countless accounts of movements like this, written by braver investigators and distilled into neat, detached reports. Yet, living it firsthand was entirely a different beast. Fear doesn't obey logic, and my mind struggled to reconcile the impossible sight before me with the clinical training I'd buried myself in at the archives. I did my best to remember my training and maybe remember some defensive spells. I recited some Latin to protect myself, and a small, light hum resonated around my eyes. I knew something was working to protect me, just enough to maybe keep me safe for a few hours. It was easy to feel detached when reading about phenomena in the comfort of the archive study, surrounded by stacks of tomes and the occasional flickering candle, but here in the thick of it, there's no safety in distance. Every nerve in my body screamed danger, but pride, or perhaps something more foolish, kept me rooted. This was part of my CPD after all. I couldn't return with a report that I'd run at the first sight of trouble. "Sid," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice, though it wavered like a brittle reed, "I'm not here to hurt you." The growling stopped, but the tension didn't ease. His form flickered, wavering between presence and absence. The EMF reader continued to pulse, its rhythm as erratic as my heartbeat.
"You can't fix it,"
he said again, quieter this time but no less forceful, and then in a whisper so faint I wasn't sure if I'd heard it too late.
"It's too late."
The air grew heavier still, pressing against my chest like an iron weight. I wanted to respond, to tell him it wasn't too late and that I was here to help, but before I could find the words, Sid's form dissolved, his edges fraying in the air like smoke in a draught. The bottle stopped falling, the EMF reader fell silent, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the basement returned to its unnatural stillness. I stayed frozen for several minutes, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand before fumbling to switch it back on. Its beam illuminated the wreckage of the room, shattered glass, splintered wood, and faintly glowing shards of gin pooling on the cold stone floor. My knees trembled as I stood, and the stillness of the space now felt like mockery. Sid had made his point. He wasn't a ghost content to linger passively. He was a storm-bound in human form, and he had no intention of leaving until the weight of his story was lifted. As I climbed the stairs, my legs weak beneath me, I couldn't help but think how many such storms I'd catalogued at the archives, their fury reduced to words on the page. Here, though, the weight of the fury was palpable. I was beginning to understand why Virgil so often returned to the archives with his knuckles bloodied and his patience thin. Some ghosts don't haunt, they rage. It was clear that Sid wasn't just angry, he was trapped. His story, like so many in Victorian London, had been swallowed by history. His pain left unresolved. The archives are no strangers to spirits like Sid. They don't haunt for the sake of it. They haunt because they need to be heard. With help from Mariam, I devised a ritual. It wasn't about banishment, but remembrance. In the basement, beneath a single lantern's light, I laid out relics of Sid's life, a crust of bread, a replica of a Victorian penny, and an asylum's death records. Each object carried a weight, tethered to the boy's life and suffering. Speaking the ritual aloud felt like stepping into the archives themselves, a litany of forgotten names and forgotten pain. "Sid," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You were wronged, but you deserve better. I see you, and I won't let you be forgotten." As his form flickered into view, I couldn't help but think of all the Sid-like figures whose stories I'd catalogued. This wasn't just about exorcism. It was about memory, about justice, however small. The objects felt fragile in my hand as I arranged them out on the cold stone floor. Bread, a penny, the asylum records. They seemed woefully inadequate, mere tokens of a life crushed by neglect and cruelty. The lantern's light flickered, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts on the damp walls. "Sid," I began, my voice steadier despite the weight pressing against my chest. "You were wronged. You deserve better. I see you, and I won't let you be forgotten." The air grew thicker as his form flickered into view again, clearer this time, but still fractured like a reflection of shattered glass. His eyes were wide, the rage softened now into something else. Fear, sadness, hope. The room grew impossibly still as I spoke the words Miriam had given to me, each one feeling like a thread, pulling Sid closer to freedom. As I finished, Sid's form began to dissolve, the edges fraying like smoke caught in the wind. He looked at me one last time, his mouth forming silent words I couldn't hear, but the weight lifted, the cold ebbed, and in its place came a warmth that seemed to seep into the stones themselves. The boy was gone, but something lingered, a faint sound, like laughter carried on the breeze. The Bleeding Rose has been quiet since that. The staff had returned and the regulars no longer speak of shadows or whispers. As I packed my equipment, I caught a faint sound of a boy's laughter, distant but unmistakable. I didn't mention it to Hayward as I left. I think some echoes are meant to linger. Back at the archives, I classified the case as a Class 3 intelligent aberration. Sid's story now sits in the records, a testament to the cruelty of Victorian London and the resilience of its forgotten souls. I wrote the final report with an odd sense of fulfillment, knowing that Sid had been seen and his voice finally heard. But as I filed this case away in section Delta-3, I found my thoughts drifting back to the others like him. Sid's story, for all its tragedy, was one of countless others woven into the fabric of Whitechapel, into London itself. The archives are filled with fragments of lives like his. Orphans, vagrants, and outcasts whose voices were drowned by the tide of history. We label them, categorize them phenomena, and seal them away in files. But how often do we truly listen? After shelving the file, I wandered through the archives, past the labyrinthine rows of cases waiting to be cross-referenced or revisited. The faint hum of the place seemed louder than the night's air, and something heavier than usual. Perhaps it's just my mood, or perhaps it's Sid's case had stirred something deeper within these halls. I paused in front of a shelf marked as multi-dimensional and temporal disruptions. One of the cases, a sealed envelope marked with the mudlark of Brick Lane scrawled across the top, caught my eye. I remembered cataloguing it years ago. Another child story, another life fragmented by loss. I hadn't thought of it since, but now it seemed to weigh differently. Were those files merely records, or were they monuments, silent markers of lives we're meant to honour? As I returned to my desk, I thought about what this mandated field work had taught me. These cases, these lives, weren't just haunting because of their otherworldly nature. They haunted because they revealed cracks in our history, the people we had abandoned, the lives we'd erased. Fieldwork had a way of making those cracks visible in a way pages of a file never could. Virgil passed by, his coat still damp from the evening rain. He nodded in greeting, his usual gruff demeanour softened by the late hour. Heard you handled the pub thing. About the kid? Sid, I replied, glancing back towards the shelves. He's, quiet now. Bethnal gave a knowing hum, leaning against the edge of my desk. They're not all like that, he said. Some don't want to move on. Some don't even care if you see them or not. I know, I said quietly. But the ones who do, I think they deserve it. He didn't argue, just shrugged and disappeared into the corridors, his footsteps fading into the hum of the archives. Alone again, turned to my notes and started writing the follow-up analysis. Protocol demanded it, but my thoughts lingered elsewhere. The archives are vast, and for every case we resolve, there are 100 more that sit unanswered. Sid's laughter still echoed faintly in my memory, a reminder that ghosts are not merely remnants, they're stories waiting to be told, and as much as I dreaded the next summons to the field, I couldn't shake the thought that perhaps this work, messy, unsettling, and deeply human, was more important than I'd allowed myself to admit. For the first time in years, I didn't close my notebook when the hour grew late. Instead, I wrote until dawn, cataloguing Sid's story in full, but also jotting notes for the future, because these weren't just cases, these were lives, and someone had to remember. I'll see you next time. Felix out. Wow, that was an incredible episode. Thank you so much, Felix, and thank you so much to the viewers for tuning in and joining us here on the podcasts down in the very damp Bethnal archives. Thank you so much for all the support so far, and obviously make sure that you like, subscribe, leave a comment. As the channel is very young, it does help the algorithm push it out to more people and get more people involved. Of course, the more interest we have in the channel, the more it pushes us to interview more of the staff, and I'll try and get as many stories out of them as possible. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Obviously, this is Joe the intern here. Hopefully I won't be an intern for long. They might give me a full-time job if I can actually prove to them that this is working. See you later. Bye.